Good morning, and thank you all for joining us today for this critically important discussion. I'm Liz Moyo, and since January 2018, I have been honored to serve as the treasurer of the great state of New Jersey. I know it's with a tremendous sense of relief that we find ourselves finally emerging from the health crisis that was brought on by COVID-19. Its effects, as you all know, have had a depth and breadth unlike anything we've seen for generations. But with each new vaccination, we're one step closer towards eliminating the physical threat of COVID for ourselves and our loved ones. We're here today, though, because while the COVID pandemic was first and foremost a health crisis, it also created an economic crisis in which some were more affected than others. The purpose of our discussion this morning is to examine one disproportionately affected group, a group that makes up more than half of our population, and a group that prior to the pandemic made up more than half of the paid workforce. That's right, I'm talking about women. The economic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately affected women, driving millions out of the workforce at much higher rates than men, and creating ripple effects that will be felt for years to come. Today, we're going to examine how and why women have struggled economically in greater numbers during this pandemic. We'll look at the inequities and challenges that we faced prior to the pandemic, which set the stage for the current crisis, and what steps we can take to better support women in the workforce in order to build a stronger, more resilient economy for all of us. Before I introduce the governor and first lady and our lieutenant governor, I'd like to take a minute to lay out the program for this morning. Following these opening remarks, we will have our first hour-long panel discussion with a team of renowned experts who will explain for us the economic data at the heart of this she-cession. We will follow with a brief 5-minute break, after which our focus is going to shift to policy. What governments and companies are doing to help address the root causes leading to these disparities, and ideas and discussion regarding potential policies and next steps to lead to greater progress. We will begin that discussion with two perspectives on the problems faced. The first, a national perspective from Reshma Saujani, founder and CEO of Girls Who Code, and founder of the Marshall Plan for Moms, a national coalition and movement first announced in December 2020 that urges a national focus and recognition of the undervalued and critical importance that mothers play in our national economy. This will be followed by a short video produced by one of today's panelists, Jessica Gonzalez, highlighting the real-life perspectives of several women as they describe the challenges they faced during the past year. We will then finish up with our second panel, a policy discussion with businesses and governmental leaders regarding steps that have been taken and steps that need to be taken in order to address the economic disparities and challenges faced by women in today's economy. And our plan is to wrap things up by 12 o'clock. If our schedule and discussion allows, we hope to take some questions from you, the audience. And if you'd like to submit a question for our panelists, you can do so through the YouTube comments section anytime between now and the conclusion of our first panel. We would also like to thank those who took the time to fill out our survey, and we'd like to encourage all who have not yet responded to please do so. It can be accessed through your Eventbrite registration. Your input and stories will help inform the discussion as we work to address and tackle these challenges. And now I'd like to introduce our first two presenters to provide some opening and welcoming remarks on behalf of the Garden State. Since taking office, Governor Phil Murphy has focused on building a stronger and fairer New Jersey that works for every family by restoring fiscal responsibility, delivering real property tax relief, growing the state's economy, and investing in its people. Under his leadership, New Jersey has made strides in creating and expanding economic opportunity while shrinking long-standing inequities. He has made New Jersey a national leader in securing the dignity of working families by signing one of the strongest pay equity laws in the nation, by putting New Jersey on the path to a $15 per hour minimum wage, by guaranteeing earned sick days, and by expanding paid family leave. measures that have helped lessen the economic impact of COVID-19 on New Jersey families. Joining the governor today is First Lady Tammy Murphy. Few people have been a bigger champion for women and children than the First Lady. She has worked tirelessly to make infant and maternal health the centerpiece of her policy initiatives. She's worked to create family festivals across the state to increase access to resources for mothers, children, and families, and has partnered with the New Jersey Economic Development Authority to increase angel investing in women-led businesses. It's my pleasure now to introduce two people who really need no introduction, Governor Phil Murphy and First Lady Tammy Murphy.
Hey everybody, Governor Phil Murphy, along with First Lady Tammy Murphy here. It is our honor to be a part of the Treasurer's Symposium on COVID, Women in the Economy. And we want to thank our incredible Treasurer, Liz Moyo, for recognizing just how important this issue is to New Jersey today.
This past year, as both work and school became remote, so many women across the state have taken on more responsibilities than ever before. I know that as time passes and our lives begin to return to normal, we will forever be in awe of and indebted to the women who have sustained our families, our communities, and our economy during this unprecedented time. Our administration knows that women will be at the forefront of our state's recovery, and we are doing all we can to provide resources through our budget priorities, as well as our partnership with Golden Seeds and the New Jersey Economic Development Authority.
Amen to all. But today's program is not just about what we are already doing. It is about diving deep into this problem to see what more we can do and how we can position ourselves as a leader for the nation in supporting women in the workforce. That means identifying all of the challenges that women face as they struggle to return to work, including finding solutions for childcare, continuing the decades-long fight for pay equity, and examining how women of color have been disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Many of these challenges are complex, and their solutions will require systemic change. But with our incredible Lieutenant Governor Sheila Oliver, our Chief Policy Advisor, Dr. Zakiya Smith-Ellis, our esteemed Treasurer, Liz Moyo, and all of the dedicated partners participating today, we are in good hands.
Amen. Thank you all so much for your commitment to the women of New Jersey, and we wish you the very best for a productive and successful symposium.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. The governor's partner in leadership for the past 4 years has been an unwavering advocate for social justice and women's equality for decades. Lieutenant Governor Sheila Oliver, who also serves as the Commissioner of the Department of Community Affairs, is a true trailblazer. From 2003 to 2018, she served in the New Jersey State Assembly, where she rose to become the first African-American woman in state history to serve as Speaker, and just the second in the nation's history to lead a state legislative house. In winning election as our state's lieutenant governor, she became the first woman of color to serve in statewide elected office in New Jersey history. I was proud to serve with her in the state legislature and to serve with her now as a member of Governor Murphy's cabinet. And I'm so pleased to have her here with us today. New Jersey's incomparable Lieutenant Governor, Sheila Oliver.
Thank you so much, Liz. And I want to just say to the treasurer that you and your team have created a wonderful platform this morning to discuss an issue that is going to be tackled with, quite frankly, during the whole entire next decade. The pandemic and women and the economy. Many years ago, a friend gave me a book by an author, Dr. Julia Boyd. And the book is called In the Company of My Sisters. I think it is extremely important for women from all backgrounds, all persuasions, all socioeconomic strata to begin to articulate and voice what their experience has been during this pandemic. We know that women have always been the primary nurturers and caretakers of their families. And it took a long time for society to become accepting of women stepping outside of not just the child rearing role, but to enter the world of business and employment. And many women labored tediously for years to climb up the career ladder and to make certain that they were able to fulfill some of their own aspirations and dreams. I think about how when COVID-19 hit, for many women, that investment of time and training and, all the things that they had aspiration for really became deflated in some instances because women had to revert to assuming 100% responsibility for the primary caretaker role. There's an old African proverb that the hand that rocks the cradle guides the nation. And women were called to the front in order to guide the nation through rocking that cradle. With schools shut down and childcare centers and other kinds of childcare arrangements that women had, women were faced with the unenviable choice of having to make a decision to part ways. And if they were not permitted to work remotely from home, many of them found themselves without income and no job to return back to. I think this is one of the realities we will confront as we address the issue of the she-cession. I also want to have us acknowledge that from an emotional place, this has been extremely tough on women as the primary caretakers of the family, and in many instances, the extended family and parents and grandparents. Many women found themselves having to juggle so many balls. And I love when we all were conducting business virtually. I loved when I would hear women taking care of their business, but also hearing the voices of their children in the background. I think that we have created a model in terms of how women can continue to be very contributing members to whatever industry they were connected to. They can continue to assume and become more involved in those family responsibilities and can successfully balance that with having a career. I often think about one of our advocates drawing to my attention during the pandemic that, when the governor had to issue various executive orders to keep all of us safe, curfews were implemented. We asked for young people, not to hang out and not to, come together as they would like to and socialize. But someone in the Trenton community pointed out to me, do you realize that in many low-income families in this state, people are living in really condensed living situations? There may only be 1,000 square feet on the first floor of an apartment or even in a duplex. And why the young people are outside after curfew, because it's a bit crowded within those households. I thought about that. As the various organizations and local governments and our own state government began to address food insecurity, I think about working some of those food distribution initiatives. And what you would see coming through were women losing income and now having to figure out how to feed their families. Many women shared with me that many of their children would have breakfast and lunch at school, and then they would have only to be responsible for dealing with dinner. With a reduced income, I want all of us to just imagine and walk in the other person's shoes, how difficult it was for women, and it continues to be difficult for many women and their households to even adequately feed themselves on reduced income. And I want to close with just paying a homage to even within the family relationships and how relationships were stressed. Many husbands, wives, significant others make a lot of jokes during the pandemic that we're getting to really dislike one another because we're spending so much time together face to face. I think that in addition to having to struggle with the economic losses that women have suffered, it also has changed the dynamic of many relationships. And that is going to have some significant impact as women begin to transition back to work. So I just want to thank the Office of the Treasurer and the Treasurer for creating this forum and platform today. This is a very complex issue, as Governor Murphy pointed out in his opening remarks. But I know, as always, the leaders of New Jersey will come together. I know that we have a strong woman advocacy network in our state, and I know that we will be there to support women as they begin to rebuild their lives. And good luck to all of our panelists this morning as they delve deeper into the issue. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you. Those were incredible remarks and a great way to help kick off today's discussion. And you're right, these issues are very complex, and this first panel is going to help start to try and unravel some of what we've been facing here during the pandemic and before the pandemic, what kind of put us in a position where we started out a few squares behind before we ever left the gate during this crisis. Our first panel is going to address the economic data, illustrating the disproportionate ways in which women were affected by COVID-19. And we're honored to have a truly distinguished group of panelists joining us for this discussion. And I'm going to first introduce them, starting with Emily Martin. She's the Vice President for Education and Workplace Justice at the National Women's Law Center, or NWLC. The NWLC has been a fighter for gender justice for almost 50 years, utilizing the law through the courts and through public policy to expand opportunities and break down barriers for women. Emily oversees the NWLC's advocacy, policy, and education efforts to ensure fair treatment and equal opportunity for women and girls at work. And she works to forward policy frameworks that allow them to achieve and succeed, with a particular focus on the obstacles that confront women and girls of color and women in low-wage jobs. Next, we have Elise Shaw, and she's a study director at the Institute for Women's Policy Research, or IWPR. The IWPR is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that engages in research and dissemination to shape public policy and improve the lives and opportunities for women from diverse backgrounds. Elise directs IWPR projects on the status of women in the United States, women's political participation, and projects related to women and girls of color, which examine the intersectional nature of race and gender on women's lives. She has also worked extensively on workforce development and job training initiatives and contributes to IWPR's research on global women's issues. She co-authored IWPR's recent study of the economic impact of the gender pay gap by state. Yana Rogers is a professor in Rutgers University's Department of Labor Studies and Employment Relations, and in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies. She also serves as faculty director at the Center for Women and Work at Rutgers. Yana has worked regularly as a consultant for the World Bank, United Nations, and the Asian Development Bank, and was president of the International Association for Feminist Economics. She specializes in using quantitative methods and large data sets to conduct research on women's health, labor market status, and well-being. Leslie Hirsch is the Assistant Commissioner of Research and Information at the New Jersey Department of Labor and Workforce Development. Her office, among other things, is responsible for producing and delivering labor market intelligence, reviews and improves private career schools and eligible training providers, reports on the performance of workforce and benefits programs, and supports the department's strategic enforcement initiatives. Her 25-year career has centered on using research to inform policies and programs for low-income earners, and she is recognized as an innovator in producing rigorous research that is both accessible and action-oriented. So welcome to everybody. This first question is going to be for all of you. And I'm wondering if you could just first please provide us with a brief overview of your work on this topic. And if possible, we'd also, I think, love to hear what drives you in your work, why you personally feel that the focus of our work today is so important. And Leslie, I'll kick off with you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and good morning to all of those who are listening. Well, I would say that I'm probably the only one here who doesn't specialize in issues around women in work. But I have spent the greater part of my career as an applied policy researcher in an effort to improve policies and practices for people who aren't, for a variety of reasons, well served in our current economic system or by our current social safety net. So as a woman and a labor economist focusing on workforce benefits and labor enforcement for the DOL, I'm keenly aware of the conditions that women work in up and down the income scale. In fact, a major reason I joined this administration is to provide research support for the governor's progressive workforce and workplace policies. The focus of the roundtable is particularly critical to me because it shines a light on so many conditions in the workplace that affect women and, by extension, as the Lieutenant Governor said, all of us, and brings into much sharper relief some of the shortcomings of our workplace policies and social safety net. Thank you.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Jana, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you. And good morning, everyone. Well, consistent with the one of the Rutgers mantras of New Jersey roots and global reach, at our research center on women and work at Rutgers, we have focused extensively on what's been happening with women in New Jersey and how they've been impacted in terms of their wages, their employment or lack of employment, and their work at home, and the relationship between their work at home and their ability to participate in the labor market and how that's changed during the pandemic. And we've also been tracking that globally. And one of my activities has been to collaborate, working on a special issue of a journal, of the journal Feminist Economics, all about the impact of COVID-19 on women around the world. And we are finding disproportionate impacts both in the labor market as well as at home. And as Lieutenant Governor Oliver alluded to, even issues with relationships at home, an increase in domestic violence, and differences in access to health and health impacts. So we're keenly aware of the importance of tracking this data, the first part of the panel, as well as devising gender responsive policies to recover from the pandemic.
Thank you. Elise, would you like to go next?
Sure. First, thank you so much for having me here today. This is a topic I am very passionate about, and it's really, really important to talk about these issues, especially at the state level. This research is really central to all of IWPR's work. It's really what I would call our bread and butter. We really are doing all sorts of research around the impacts, the economic impacts that the COVID pandemic has had, and then before. We've been tracking We've been tracking the share of women in the labor force and unemployment numbers since the last Great Recession. We do it every month when the DOL puts out their numbers. So this is really a central issue that we're looking at. What's going on for women and what's going on for different groups of women across the country. In my work as the study director for the status of women in the states, it's really central to that topic. This is a key moment when we see the COVID-19 pandemic had really impacted different women in different states in different ways, given the decentralized nature of the response. States were really left to do what they felt was best. And prior to the pandemic, we saw, differences in where you live. So where you live matters on your ability to flourish economically. I think for me personally, and I am a single mom, working single mom of a first grader. And so I have gotten even more passionate about these issues. She does half her school day at home still, half in person finally. But I'm in a very privileged position to be able to work from home, to work remotely, to have job security. And even so, throughout this pandemic, it's been a rough year. So I really want to dig down personally and say, what can we do for women across the United States to ensure that it's not the case anymore where you live matters, that all women have the same opportunities to thrive.
Oh, thank you. And I think it's important. One of the reasons we're having this conference today is because we don't want to miss the opportunity that this has laid bare so many disparities that have existed prior, but that, this has shown such a bright light on, and we cannot miss the opportunity to really focus on it and learn from it and take some action. So thank you for those remarks. Emily, would you like to?
Sure. So at the National Women's Law Center, as our name suggests, we really think about how can law and policy help change the world for women and girls in this country. And so our work over the past year has been twofold. First, making sure that we understand the shape of the problem that we're trying to solve. So like so many folks on this panel, we have really tried to dig into the numbers to understand how COVID has shaped women's job loss, where are those jobs being lost, who is losing those jobs, how is the recession over the past year hit differently depending on your race, whether you have a disability, what occupation you work in, and why. And then the other part of our work at the National Women's Law Center has been identifying the policy levers that could make a difference in the lives of women and families as we've met this unprecedented challenge. And the reason why I think the work is important, that I feel really lucky to be part of the work, is because it goes to sort of really basic questions for us as a country about fairness, about opportunity, about who will have a chance to succeed and thrive. And during this past year of literally unprecedented challenges, there have been and continue to be a lot of stark questions that are being posed about how do we respond, what do we value, how do we actually value the work of women, how do we actually value families, and how do we ensure that we have law and policy frameworks that live those values. So I'm excited to be here today in conversation with all of you about that.
That's great. Thanks, Emily. I want to first turn to, as some of us have just mentioned, there were inequities leading into this pandemic, which set us back before we even entered the crisis. And I want to focus first on one of those, which is the wage gap. We're all aware it has existed for a long time between men and women, and it has affected women and their financial security. But in order to really fully understand the breadth of the consequences, not just to women, but to the economy in its entirety, we need to examine the data and the story it tells. So I'd like to first kind of set the stage as it existed before we entered the pandemic, and why so many women were already at a disadvantage to weather the pandemic. And Elise, I'd like to start with you. I think it would be helpful if you could give us an overview of wage disparities for women in the US and New Jersey, including how race and ethnicity factor into the findings. I'm also wondering if you could, while you're at it, shed a little light on what the IWPR refers to as the motherhood penalty, if you could.
Definitely, happy to do so. As you said, Elizabeth, we hear about the wage gap every year. We have Equal Pay Day, and there's a lot of fanfare. And currently we hear that women earn about 81 and a half cents per every dollar that a white man earns. So IWPR has done our own projections on when the wage gap will close, and these are actually optimistic projections. If you do actual really great modeling, the wage gap will never close, but that's a depressing story. So if we just do a simple linear projection, we've projected that the wage gap for women will close in the year 2059. That's for all women. There's huge disparities by race and ethnicity. If you look at especially Black and Latinas, Black women and Latinas, they earn much less on average. Black women earn about 62 cents for every dollar that a white man earns, and Latina women earn about 54 cents for every dollar. For those projections, for Black women, it's projected to close in about 112 years, so 2133. And for Latinas, it's a wait of almost 200 years, 2220. This is unacceptable and a huge disparity among the women in the United States. The wage gap in New Jersey actually looks similar to the United States. You're not really that dissimilar. There's, like you said, there's a lot of stuff going on in New Jersey for women, and so you've been making progress. So the wage gap in New Jersey is about 80 cents for every dollar for women overall. When you look at the disparities, though, again, for Black women and Latinas, it's much, much more stark. In New Jersey, Black women earn about 56 cents for every dollar, and they earn about $35,000 less than white men do on average in New Jersey. When you look at Latinas, it's actually even a bigger gap, and this is the biggest gap that women in New Jersey have. Latinas earn 43 cents for every dollar that white men earn, and they earn a full $45,000 a year less than white men on average. So that's a huge gap for the disparities among women in New Jersey. White women and Asian Pacific Islander women are doing much better, though there is still a gap. For Asian Pacific Islander women, it's about 90% of what white men earn, so they earn about 90 cents to the dollar. And for white women, it's about the same as the average, about 80 cents. So these are huge, huge gaps overall. While these averages are based on median earnings, so it's just taking everyone and averaging them out, these actually point to the nuances of what's going on here. I like to say, if the wage gap can seem complicated because there's a lot of things that factor into it, but those are actually your entry points for how to address the wage gap. So it's the factor of women, specifically Black women and Latinas, being concentrated in lower paying jobs. It's outright pay discrimination at times. It's low wages following women from job to job. If you base, your new job salary off of your previous salary history, it's the fact that we don't have good transparency for wages in jobs, so women can be paid less. And then, like you said, the motherhood penalty. We talk about the motherhood penalty. It's really kind of this penalty that gets laid on women once they have children. This happens for a variety of reasons. Sometimes women are seen as less committed to their careers once they have children. People just assume that they will be pulled away. Women also do tend to take more time out of the workforce to act as caregivers. So they are taking a hit to their careers. Oftentimes they don't have as many opportunities for advancement and progress inside their own industry. So you'll even see when we break it down by occupation and occupational groups, you'll see that women earn less in just about every single group than men do nationally. And it's because women's lack of, limited opportunities for advancement.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that your data on salaries in New Jersey, do you know what year that data is?
So that data is 2019 data and 2018 data, depending on when we ran it. So
okay.
It's all pre-pandemic, yes.
Okay.
So we'll see
It's
how
also, I asked because as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the governor signed into law one of the very strong pay equity bill in 2018. So I'll be curious to see the effects that has as we move forward and get
yeah, I was going to mention that New Jersey's doing really well with its recent laws, and but I think we'll see a lag before we see that impact the actual data. But it's really exciting for me as somebody who tracks this by state to see where New Jersey will start to fall. But even so, with all of this, because of this, mothers are more likely to live in poverty. If you look at the share of working women who are living in poverty in New Jersey, it's about 6% of working women. But almost 1 in 4 working single mothers live in poverty in New Jersey. And again, this is pre-pandemic data.
Yeah, can't imagine it improved. Yeah.
And according to our recent analysis, pay equity has a huge impact. It's actually a bigger impact in New Jersey than it does in the nation overall. While pay equity would reduce poverty for working women by about 40% nationally, it actually cuts it in half in New Jersey by our estimation. So that's a huge difference for both working women and working single mothers.
Yeah, I was going to ask Emily a bit of what she can tell us and how she can help us understand the long-term economic impacts of this wage gap in relation to poverty and the financial stability, both for women and their families, sort of driving home the message, why even those who think this issue doesn't affect them, why they should care about the wage gap and what it's created throughout our economy.
Well, the wage gap impact is large in any particular year, but as you look at the effects of the wage gap over a woman's career, the numbers are really quite enormous. So women typically lose over $10,000 a year to the wage gap when you compare all women to all men, comparing median income. So that means that a woman starting her career today stands to lose over $400,000 to the wage gap over a 40-year career. And again, if we look specifically at Black women and compare them to white men, the typical annual loss is more than $24,000 a year, and that's looking nationally. As we just heard from Elise, in New Jersey, it's an even larger amount. For Latinas, over 29,000. And so that means over a 40-year career, Black women stand to lose over $900,000 to the wage gap, and Latinas over $1 million. So that's really life-changing money that's being lost. It means that women of color aren't building wealth. It impacts not just the trajectory of women's lives and their family lives, but really whole communities are losing wealth in a way that could be transformative if we got to equity. And again, all of these numbers are numbers from pre-pandemic data. We don't have the 2020 wage gap numbers yet, but we do know that over the past year, we've seen nearly 2 million women leave the workforce entirely, meaning they're no longer working or looking for work. And among women who are unemployed currently, about 30% have been out of work for a year or more. And so we know those long spells out of the workforce or out of work tend to depress your wages when you go back to work. And so the pandemic's disproportionate impact on women and on women of color in particular, on women in low-paid jobs, things we'll talk about more this morning, really threatens to show up as a wider gender wage gap in the years to come. So that's a reason why it's really important at this moment, as we're thinking about policy responses to COVID and to the recession, to have gender equity really front and center, because otherwise I think we're really at risk of not just moving incredibly slowly and closing the wage gap as Elise described, but actually moving backwards in the months and years to come.
Yeah, I was going to ask Jana also how the pre-existing wage gap was exacerbated or affected by the pandemic, and what your data indicates we can expect to see as the economy continues to recover. What can we expect in terms of economic loss for women and for our national economy and local economy?
Such a great question, because the answer is complex in a way, as both Elise and Emily have referenced. Looking first at global data for all income, we have seen from data from the International Labor Organization that across countries, including the US, women have lost more income during the pandemic compared to men, and roughly a 10% cut in labor income for US women and about 8% for US men. And that's coming largely from employment losses, which have been harder. Women were harder hit in terms of employment losses compared to men in most countries, including the US. But if we look specifically at wages of people who still have their jobs, so wage and salary workers, even though the official overall numbers for 2020 haven't been released yet, as Emily referenced, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has been releasing quarterly reports looking at quarterly wages. So I looked at these numbers yesterday, and what we've seen in most quarters since the pandemic hit is that the wage ratio of wage and salary workers has actually increased. So women's relative wages have gone up slightly during the pandemic. So for example, in the second quarter of 2020, the wage ratio was 84% compared to a year earlier, the second quarter of 2019, it was only 81.4%. If we do that again for the last quarter of 2020, again, we see a small increase in the wage ratio. And the most recent quarter, the first quarter of 2021, compared to the first quarter a year ago, a small increase in women's relative wages. And I think this is happening because of relatively more women at the low wage scale lost their jobs. And what's left is women earning, slightly more. And that is in a way artificially increasing this wage ratio. So what's like good news, the women's relative earnings rose during the pandemic is more of an artifact of more low wage women losing their jobs or being forced to leave the workforce because of having to take care of kids. One of the documents that your office, Liz, has just released shows that childcare is incredibly expensive, especially in the state of New Jersey. So it's been more difficult for families to pay for childcare, which means in a way that many, especially women, have had to leave their jobs in order to take care of kids and to homeschool their kids during the pandemic. So I think my overall point is that women's overall earnings have dropped more compared to men. But if we look at those women who are still working, the wage ratio appears to have gone up, but that is more of an artifact of who has kept their jobs.
Yeah, we've seen that here in Treasury, just in tracking our revenues for the past year, the roller coaster ride that has been, and that this has clearly been what they can call a K-shaped recession, where people at the higher end of the wage scale have really, to the extent they were affected at all by the pandemic, really bounced back quickly. And those at the lower end of the pay scale really bore the brunt of this pandemic. And I think before I leave the wage gap discussion, I just want to point out, and Elise, you may have been leading into this point, but I know the IWPR just issued a paper, and it talked about if we can close that wage gap across the country. I just want to get this GDP figure in there. If we can eliminate the wage gap for women across the country, we can cut poverty levels, like you said, by 40%, 48% in New Jersey. And in New Jersey, for the question about, for those who think this doesn't affect them and why should they focus on this, even so, that would translate to, according to the IWPR research, that would translate to an increase in our gross domestic product of 3.1% or $19.6 billion. So I just want to leave with that kind of tidbit before we move on to the next topic, which is basically, enter 2020 and the pandemic, which turned all of our lives upside down in so many ways, but one of which was certainly financially, as we've been discussing. And many of us were first introduced to the term she-cession, which means an economic downturn which disproportionately affected women. And I just want to look at the numbers and explain first if, and then how and why this pandemic economically was devastating for so many women. And I want to start with Leslie, just to first look at the labor market and find out what you've seen in terms of the unemployment numbers for women as compared to men during the pandemic, including not only those who lost their jobs, but also those who left the workforce. Can you just give us some insight into that, Leslie?
Sure, absolutely.
Thanks.
So as we know, despite decades of advancement in the economy, we still spend more time than men on unpaid household responsibilities, including caring for family members, including children. So when schools shut their doors, working mothers suddenly found themselves homeschooling their children while trying to maintain their jobs or their education. If they had the ability to telework, that was at home. If not, it meant finding childcare in a condition of tremendous scarcity, or having to choose between work and care. Women are also essential workers and healthcare providers. According to my own calculations, using the Homeland Security definition, it seems that 1.1 million women in New Jersey were in critical infrastructure jobs during the recession, including 213,000 on the front lines in healthcare. So turning to unemployment first, at the worst point of the recession, New Jersey lost more than 700,000 jobs. We've regained 388,000 plus in the 11 months since April 2020, or about 54% of the jobs lost. In the first full month when shutdowns were in effect, that's April 2020, national unemployment among women was a whopping 16% compared to 16.1% compared to 13.6% for men. And this was true across all age levels. The gap closed over time and reversed itself at the end of 2020, as overall unemployment has receded back down to 6.1% nationally, with women at 5.8% unemployment. Just as women of all ages were worse off at the beginning of the recession than men in the same age brackets, women of all age groups now have slightly lower unemployment rates nationally. So I would have thought that New Jersey would provide a similar picture. And because of some of the limitations of the data we use to measure unemployment rate, it's kind of difficult to get comparable figures for sex, age, or race. However, just this morning, in fact, about 15 minutes ago, the Bureau of Labor Statistics Regional Office, thank you very much, emailed me over a special analysis using 12-month averages. And so, which makes it a little bit difficult to compare, but let's take a look in any case. The 12-month average in April 2020, which captures the growth year before April 2020, was 4.7% for women and 4.4% for men, which is the same as what we saw nationally, that women had a higher unemployment rate. However, it is now in April 2021, the 12-month average is still higher at 11.2% for women and 8.2% for men. And so that gap is actually widened in New Jersey. However, I just want to keep in mind that this could be a little bit misleading because we're capturing both periods that we see in the national data. When women's unemployment rate was higher in 2020 and in the opening months of 2021 when it was lower. So that's at the national rate. So we really need to keep an eye on this going forward, because if that's really the case, that New Jersey is somehow different, we really need to dig more deeply and see what's happening. In addition to women, young adults, people with less education, Hispanic women, immigrants also experience greater job losses. Unpartnered mothers saw a bigger drop in their share at work than other parents. And low-wage workers saw a particularly sharp decrease in employment, which is alarming. So perhaps even more alarming is the negative effect that the recession has had on women's labor force participation. In the first year of the recession, according to Pew, about 2.5 million women left the labor force. Women accounted for a majority of the decrease in the labor force, even though we make up less than half of the workforce. Before the recession, 58% of working women participated in the labor force. At the lowest point in the recession, that went from 58% to 54%. A little more than a year later, 55%. So we've recovered somewhat, but we still have quite a way to go to recover the women's 58% participation rate. For the sake of comparison, New Jersey is now at 63 or 62.6% labor force participation, but was at 64.7 in February 2020, before the onset of the pandemic. So we went down a little over 2%. Again, it's difficult to get the data at the New Jersey level. Among racial and ethnic groups nationally, labor force participation dropped the most among Black and Latinx women. As most, if not all of you know, people who aren't in the labor force are not counted among the unemployed, at least in the official, what we call U3 measure of unemployment. Thus, the true number of women out of work is much, much greater. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the drop in labor force participation we have experienced across the board nationally is greater than in the last recession and greater than in any other one-year period since World War II. I almost want to repeat that because it's just so dramatic. If New Jersey's U6 measure, now that is a measure of labor underutilization that would include discouraged workers, part-time workers, people who are working part-time for economic reasons and so forth. We're now at 16.7% unemployment, more than double the official unemployment rate. So because of the shortcomings, again, we have to just kind of figure out that what's happening beneath the surface by looking at round numbers. And because I received that data only about 15 or 20 minutes ago, I wasn't able to disaggregate it by sex yet. So maybe I can come back, but I really want to listen to everybody's presentation.
Thank you. Wow.
I do have one more thing to share, and that's about unemployment insurance claims. So that one, we do have really good data. Even though women make up 47% of the labor force, we at our peak, at women's peak, the percentage of UI claims, of initial UI claims, was as high as 55%. So that's an 8 percentage point difference between 47% of labor force and 55% of the UI claims. The underlying reasons are your next question, so I'll hold off on discussing that.
All right, great. Thank you, Leslie. That was very informative. I really appreciate it. And I was going to ask Elise just to take a little deeper dive into the data and do me a favor and define for our listeners today the term breadwinner mothers, and share any data you have. Elise gave us some stats on this, but any data you have regarding the percentage of breadwinner mothers who've suffered job loss or who were forced to leave the job market during the pandemic, and why is this statistic important?
So this statistic is important because of the very definition of breadwinner mothers. So in IWPR, we define breadwinner mothers as any mother who has a child under 18 living at home who earns at least 40% of the overall household income, which means their earnings are essential to the economic security and well-being of families. As we've said, women also shoulder the lion's share of the caregiving at home. So these are women who are really bringing in significant amount of income to their families and providing a lot of care. Prior to the pandemic, according to our numbers, about half of families in the United States had a breadwinner mother. This went up a staggering 4 out of 5 Black mothers, and 2 in 3 Native mothers are breadwinner mothers. And the vast majority of them are actually single mothers. This can actually be attributed to the wage gap because white women and Asian Pacific Islander women's wages are higher. They're more likely, the breadwinner mothers are a larger share of the overall breadwinner mothers because they can contribute more to their household income because they earn higher wages on average. The trend's also true for New Jersey. About half of all mothers are breadwinners, and 77% of Black mothers in New Jersey are breadwinner mothers. So we don't necessarily have specific data on the job losses during the pandemic for breadwinner mothers, but we can kind of draw those lines of, looking at the she-cession and who's been impacted the most by job loss or being, forced out of the workforce because of caregiving needs. It's going to be a huge portion of these breadwinner mothers, which means families are really, families that were getting by before might be really kind of living paycheck to paycheck, and families who are living paycheck to paycheck may be falling into poverty. And so we're just seeing this ripple effect, given the disproportionate impact on women that this pandemic has had. These women are also struggling to find jobs as the economy recovers, which I think will just continue to kind of, like I said, have this cascading effect on the economic security of families.
Okay. Thank you. Emily, I was wondering, and Leslie, if you have anything additional after Emily discusses this, maybe you can add in your own thoughts. But I'm just curious whether the fact that certain industries were disproportionately affected by the pandemic has played a role in the disproportionate effect that we're hearing it's had on women. And I'm just wondering if you can shed any light on which industries were most affected and whether you expect these industries to fully rebound post-pandemic, or do we have another problem we're going to need to address?
Yeah, so we've talked a lot today about how women have borne the brunt of the COVID recession, and that's partly because of the breakdown in caregiving infrastructure that COVID created as schools went remote, as childcare providers had to close, or as families didn't feel safe using them. But it's also because of the particular impact of this recession on the economy and on the places where women worked. So compared to, say, the Great Recession, where we saw the biggest hit, the biggest initial wave of job loss in jobs like manufacturing, the past year has been really unique in that the jobs that were hit hardest were the sorts of service jobs, often low wage service jobs that women disproportionately hold. So leisure and hospitality, for example, which includes restaurants and hotels, and a lot of the service industry has had an enormous hit over the past year as shutdowns led to occupations just shedding employment, and that's been a big driver of women's job loss. State and local governments had to cut a lot of jobs as tax revenues dried up over 2020, and women are the majority of people employed by state and local governments. Healthcare, even though healthcare was a place of essential work, also had a fair amount of job loss in 2020. Education. So these are women's jobs. Childcare, which isn't an enormous sector, but is important because it supports so many other sectors. 1 in 7 childcare jobs still has not come back. And those are jobs that are almost exclusively held by women. And then sectors like retail, which are about 50-50 in terms of men and women holding retail jobs, are striking because the job loss still was disproportionately women. So women have lost 92% of the net jobs lost in the retail sector since February 2020, which is astounding given that that's a sector which is about 50-50 men and women. And so all of that is driving what we call the she-cession, both the fact that occupations where women are the majority of workers are the occupations that have felt the most job loss, and because women have lost jobs at a higher rate than you would predict based on their percentage representation in the profession.
Do we have any, and Leslie, maybe you know something about this too, and but do we have any idea why that retail statistic is staggering? Why more women would have lost their jobs even though it's 50-50 split?
Now, I'd be curious if Leslie has thoughts. I have guesses rather than answers. I think that it may in part be because while retail is 50-50, women are, say, more likely to work in apparel stores and less likely to work in car dealerships, that it could be related to where you have seen retail job loss. I suspect it's also, though, one reason is because retail before the pandemic was an occupation where there's a lot of schedule instability, a lack of control over schedules. And over this past year, where women have disproportionately been the ones to take on the caregiving responsibilities that have suddenly increased as the world has shut down, they have less schedule flexibility. And I think in jobs like retail, that could actually be driving women's disproportionate job loss. Welcome, Leslie.
That would have been my guess. Absolutely. So I'm not sure, Emily, if those were New Jersey figures on the jobs figures before, or US figures?
Those are
national. So great, then I can provide some New Jersey information about the industries that were affected, if that's okay with you, Liz.
Yeah, sure. We have a couple more questions, and then, why don't you give us the New Jersey data? That'd be great.
Okay, sure. So similar to the nation, we were most affected in the service sectors. Unlike most recessions where the goods producing sectors have been affected and men are, male employment is actually concentrated. So in New Jersey, and I think this was in your report, Liz, women make up more than 2/3 of the healthcare and education workforces, respectively. They also make up more than half of the workforce in quote unquote other services, which includes hair salons, nail salons, and the nonprofit sector. All sectors all industries in which females are more likely to work, as well as in the accommodation, which is hotels and casinos, and food sector, which includes restaurants, fast food, and catering. So in terms of sheer numbers, almost 500,000 women work in the retail sector in New Jersey, although they don't make up the majority of that workforce in New Jersey. So when we look at job losses in those 5 sectors, accommodation, retail, healthcare, other services, and education, taken together, those 5 sectors accounted for just about 2/3 of all the jobs that were lost in New Jersey. And so since women are disproportionately employed in those, in all but retail, you can see that women were disproportionately affected by the job losses. The top 10 occupations for women, I thought I turned off my phone. Anyway, I'm going to let it go. Among the top 10 occupations in which women are employed, 8 had median wages below the state median. So, when we talk about low wage workers, I mean, this is obviously women who are low wage workers confront a lot of specific and special problems because of their caregiving responsibilities, but this is a low wage worker problem. In any case, we are in 8 out of the 10 occupations are below the state median on annual wage, which is for just $48,130 in New Jersey. And these are secretaries, cashiers, casino workers, teaching assistants, customer service reps, retail sales, waiters and waitresses, and receptionists and information clerks. So nobody has a crystal ball that can accurately predict what's going to happen, but I have a few educated guesses, and that I think some of these are supported, or most of them are supported by economists nationwide. What is going to suffer is largely going to be low wage going forward. So traditional retail, other than food retail, is going to suffer in favor of online shopping. We know this, which has grown 3 times faster in this past year than it did in the year before the pandemic. It's just amazing, 3 times faster. Anyone living in an apartment building who can see all the boxes downstairs will know what I'm talking about. Tourism, sharp cutbacks in leisure travel and business travel, and fewer people taking transit every day to get to work. So that's transit and transportation and tourism. The arts, because of reluctance of people to gather in crowds, and in-person dining in favor of takeout and delivery, which are softening the blow somewhat. I also think that we're looking at some issues around non-residential building construction because of shrinking demand for office space. That downside is somewhat mitigated by could be somewhat mitigated by infrastructure spending and by residential construction, interestingly enough, as people flee New York and Philadelphia and Wilmington for the suburbs in New Jersey. So I think the 3 major challenges here are childcare, digital divide, and a need to reskill and upskill.
Okay, thanks. And we're going to, the wrap up, I'm going to ask for all of you is just to give some advice for our next panel of policymakers. And we have about just under 15 minutes left. I want, there's another critical question I'd like us to address before we get to that, though, and that's the even greater disproportionate effect the pandemic has had on women of color. And I know there are a number of reasons, and I was wondering if Elise and Emily, you can just give us some insight into those numbers and the degree to which, and we've touched a little bit upon this in some of our other discussions here today, but the degree to which you think the recession or the she-cession we're experiencing could actually expand the race and gender disparities that already exist. And then I want to talk to Jana just about what she's seeing in terms of this in New Jersey. So Elise and Emily, can you shed some light on those numbers?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's like we've been talking throughout this, the sectors where women are concentrated have been disproportionately hit. These are, as Leslie said, female dominated and low wage jobs. And when you look within that sector itself, it's disproportionately dominated by women of color. So Black, Hispanic, Asian Pacific Islander women tend to make up a much larger share than the overall workforce in those jobs. And so it's unsurprising to see that there's a huge gap here. Some of the numbers that IDPR has looked at, when we have a publication out that is really just looking at, it's 5 graphs looking at the impact of the pandemic recession specifically on women of color. If you look at it, we looked at it between February and December 2020. The number of employed Black women dropped by almost 10% nationally. The number of Latina women dropped by about 8% compared to white women, which was only 5.2% only, 5.2%. But you just see the difference between different groups of women. Again, just this is national numbers that we have right now. If we look at Latina and Black Latinas and Black women, they're much more likely to be unemployed compared to white women. So for Latinas, it's 9% over this same time frame, 8.4% for Black women, and 5.7% for white women. So these disparities, you know, in employment numbers and in unemployment, really are going to impact the disparities that were already there. I think we're going to be tracking this, honestly, for years, if not decades to come, and really looking at some of the recent publications we put out. Our young women of color did not recover from the Great Recession before this recession hit. They were still far behind where their white counterparts were, because of the job losses that happened during the Great Recession. So if we're already tracking that, this impact is just going to compound and continue forward. When you look at, you know, the levels of long-term unemployment, among all women who are unemployed, 44% have been unemployed for at least 6 months, and it increased most strongly for Black women. So when you really, again, dig down on these numbers, yes, it's a she-cession, but not everyone is being impacted the same, and it's something that we're going to have to track for many, many years. And I think we're going to be looking at widening disparities, and we really have to be proactive about how, like you said, the policy solutions that are needed to ensure that we close those gaps.
Yeah. Emily, did you have?
Yeah, I would just agree and add, you know, we've been talking about the number of women who left the labor force over the past year, where we've sort of lost an entire generation of gains in women's labor force participation. We haven't seen this low of numbers since 1988. And again, that's a story where if we look at Black women and Latinas, they have been especially impacted. And so if we counted them in the unemployment numbers, the Black women and Latinas who are no longer looking for work and so who aren't included in the unemployment rate, in May, the unemployment rate for Black women would have been 12%. Instead of just the low 8.2%, the unemployment rate for Latinas would have been 11%. So we are talking about really significant chunks of the population with a lot of hardship that follows. I also want to mention the immigrant workers, who are a disproportionate share of the service sector workforce that has been hit so hard in this recession, have also been hit extremely hard. And that's important for a variety of reasons. One is because if they are undocumented, they're excluded from much of the relief that's been provided by the federal government. Research by Make the Road New Jersey, for example, found enormously high levels of deprivation in immigrant families as a result of COVID. A survey last year found that 81% of immigrant families surveyed reported a household member had lost a job during the pandemic, and even higher percentages said that they'd lost income or lost hours of work. And nationally, Black women, Latinas, Asian women, all are experiencing especially high rates of involuntary part-time work. So even if you still have a job, you may have lost significant hours and thus a lot of income. So all of that is leading to not just gendered impacts, but racially disparate impacts of the COVID recession.
And Yana, I know you've studied the racial economic disparities in depth, particularly as it affects women and the economy here in New Jersey, which is, given the rich diversity of our state. Can you share some of your findings with us and what, if any, are the long-term effects we can expect here in our state?
Sure, I just wanted to echo what's been said already about the pandemic, exacerbating existing discrepancies or disparities, and the pandemic having a more severe impact on wages and employment of women of color, especially. What we've talked about a little bit less is the overall wealth gap. And there, data from the CPS indicated even before the pandemic, for every $100 earned by the average white family, Black families earn just $57. And if we look at projections for after this pandemic of the overall wealth gap, Forbes had a projection that the median white household would own 86 times more wealth than Black households. And even looking simply at Americans with college degrees, white Americans with college degrees are 3 times wealthier than Black Americans with the same credentials. So in looking, after the break at policy solutions, we really need to look at policies that address these wealth discrepancies. And New Jersey, I think, takes a lead in being one of the first states where our Senator Booker, introduced, at the popular level, the notion of baby bonds, and using a baby bond kind of scheme to begin to close the wealth gap between households of color and white households, and other policies that address the wealth gap. And the other area, I think, where New Jersey stands out is the high number of domestic workers that we have. And our center has done quite a bit of work looking at domestic workers in New Jersey, who are mostly women, well over 90%, and largely immigrant workers, going back to what Emily said, and women of color. And we so far don't have a domestic worker bill of rights, but there is talk about having such. Some other states also have done so to improve not only wages, but also working conditions, which have worsened during the pandemic for domestic workers. So I would put that also on the agenda for the later in the morning to talk about in terms of policy solutions.
All right. Thanks, Yana. So I take it, and that was going to be in our 2 minutes we have left. I was going to ask you, what, based on all of the research you've done, if you had to help provide some guidance to the next group, which is going to include business leaders and government policymakers, what they should focus on. It sounds like, Yana, you would have them focus on some of those issues. Did you mentioned domestic worker bill of rights? You mentioned baby bonds and targeting the wealth gap amongst New Jerseyans. Anything else before I turn to the others that you did?
Yeah.
Does that?
I think first and foremost, any kind of policies that support care work, paid care workers, as well as unpaid work. What's been driving, especially gender differentials, is the need to provide care for children at home and how that's disproportionately borne by women. So policies that support care providers, whether they're paid or unpaid, more about those kind of policies in the session.
Okay, thanks. Emily, did any thoughts for the next panel?
Yeah, lots, but what I will prioritize is, yes, a enormous investment in childcare in this country is way overdue. We sort of had a jerry-rigged, barely working system before the pandemic exploded it, and it's been made really clear that we need to invest in childcare as critical infrastructure in this country to ensure that families can support themselves, that women can go to work, and that the childcare workers who are making all of that work possible are themselves being paid fairly and having quality jobs. The other thing that I'll say quickly is raising wages for women, and that includes a lot of things, but it includes increasing the minimum wage and ensuring that tipped workers have the same minimum wage as everybody else instead of at the federal level, their tip minimum wage is only $2.13 an hour and hasn't changed since 1991. And strengthening equal pay protections. Elise mentioned earlier, for example, the problem of pay being set based on what you earned in your last job, which can lead pay discrimination to follow women from job to job to job. And that's only one way that we should address equal pay, prohibiting that sort of pay setting based on salary history. New Jersey has definitely been at the forefront of some of these efforts, and hopefully the rest of the nation will follow. But those are some of the places that I think it's really important to focus on as we are coming out of this recession.
Thank you. And Elise, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'll start by echoing the childcare system. That's been the big one that IDPR has been talking about. And we've actually been discussing the need for a national childcare system to provide quality care for every household. We propose that no family should have to pay more than 7% of their household income for childcare. Right now, it's an exorbitant cost, and it's something that's just so cost prohibitive for most families. But one thing that hasn't been talked about is the social safety net, and really rebuilding it and expanding the social safety net. I mean, we've just seen through this pandemic just how important unemployment insurance, programs like TANF and SNAP. I would put in supplemental security income, SSI as well, expanding the EITC and other programs for workers and vulnerable families. They're just so crucial to fill those gaps right now. And I would make a call for the federal government to prioritize direct assistance to states. States know what they need and what the gaps they need to fill. And as we've heard, this pandemic has impacted state revenue as well. So states need more money for their own government, to hire back the employees that may have been had to be let go because of the drop in revenue. All of that stuff is just so crucial to making sure that women can work. And then one more thing that I'll say is collective bargaining is really, we should make sure, it kind of goes with the domestic workers, but we should really make sure that collective bargaining is really supported, and that we really do that. Union women earn more than women in general. So it's a great way to boost wages.
Yep. Yeah. And thanks. And Leslie, you want to take us home?
Sure. I would just agree with everything that's been said so far, in particular on the expansion of childcare. I would say, expanding eligibility in the childcare block grant and really enriching the childcare block grant, fair scheduling, which I think is hugely important. You cannot actually schedule your childcare if you don't know what hours you're working. It's really important for part-time workers. Women are, pretty likely to be part-time workers. And then I mentioned, I think, because of our involvement in workforce development and the issues around inequities or disparities between projected growth between industries, I would say a lot more investment in community colleges and training for upskilling and reskilling. So we're going to need, at one point Atlantic City had a 46% unemployment rate. This was I believe it was in April, it may have been in May of 2020. So just to, highlight for you just how awful it is. I don't know whether the casinos are ever going to come back completely. And so there is a real need for diversification in Atlantic City, and a real need for diversification for that workforce. So, some really targeted large scale reskilling and upskilling. And then I guess last of all, I would just say this is not a public policy issue, but something more like an advocacy issue is advocacy for workplace policies that help us balance success at home with success in the workplace or at school. Because of women's disproportionate role as caregivers, it's hugely important to achieving parity for us.
Thank you. And, we've run out of time, but I really want to thank all of you. What an extraordinary panel. So Leslie, Yana, Emily, and Elise, it's been an eye-opening discussion, I think, for many of us. And I want to thank you for taking the time out of what I know is a busy day And also thank you for the work you do each and every day on behalf of women. So thank you. And for the rest of you, we're going to take a 5-minute break, allow you to go warm up your coffees or do whatever else you need to do. And we will come back in 5 minutes. So thank you all. Thank you again. Welcome back, everybody. Before we begin our next panel, we have two presentations that will provide some additional food for thought as we consider the challenges to be addressed. The first are remarks from Reshma Saujani. She's the founder and CEO of Girls Who Code, which is an international nonprofit organization that's dedicated to closing the gender gap in technology by inspiring, educating, and equipping young women with the computing skills necessary to succeed in the 21st century. Reshma's remarks today are going to be focused on her most recent endeavor as founder of the Marshall Plan for Moms, which is an effort geared to draw national focus on the impact mothers play in our national economy. Reshma's remarks are going to be followed by a video that was produced and shared by panelist Jessica Gonzalez that highlights personal stories faced by women as they struggle to meet the demands of the past year. So I'm happy to now first start with welcome remarks by Reshma Saujani. Thanks.
The founder of Girls Who Code and the Marshall Plan for Moms. I'm so excited to join today's event to talk about mothers and the economic recovery for them. I got into this issue in 2020. In 2020, I was the CEO of Girls Who Code. We had just had a Super Bowl ad. It was going to be the best year that we've ever had. And then COVID-19 happened, and I found myself having to cancel my maternity leave because I had just had a newborn baby, homeschool my 5-year-old, and save my global nonprofit from an economic disaster. I got COVID-19, but it barely registered. My liver failed. I had acne on my face as if I was 16 years old. And when I looked at my Zoom screen, every mother looked exactly how I felt. We were exhausted. And for so many of us in those early months of the pandemic, we were just trying to grin and bear it. And we would say to each other, well, when the schools open in September, we'll get a reprieve. And then September happened. And I got about 2 weeks notice that the public school that my son was going to be going to was not going to open. There was no reprieve. And as legislators thought about the cost of the HVAC equipment, thought about the cost of keeping teachers safe, they never thought about the cost of what this would do to mothers. Because as they came up with this hybrid teaching model, it assumed that a default caretaker, a mom, would have to be at home to log on our kids at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, and 12 o'clock, all the while maintaining her full-time job. And as that happened in the months of September, we started seeing in October, December, the jobs numbers come out. We saw that over 2 million mothers had left the workforce. In December, the jobs number, all the jobs lost were moms. And I remember asking myself, well, what's the plan? What's the plan? You can't lose this many jobs this quickly. You know, when COVID-19 started, women were 51% of the labor force. And at that time, now we're at labor market participations of 1989. We had lost 30 years of progress in 9 months. So I launched the Marshall Plan for Moms as an op-ed to say, here's my plan. If y'all don't have one, here's what I think that we need to do to support moms, to make them feel seen, and to get them back to work. And here were some of the ideas that we set forth. First, we needed basic income payments to mothers. Every mom I talked to would say, I just need some cash, whether it's to pay the bills, whether it's to pay the mortgage, whether it's to put food on the table, or help support our kids' education. And now, today, that form of cash has come in the child care tax credit, where every parent in July will get about $300 a month to help support them in their needs to make sure that they can take care of their children. The second thing that we needed was paid leave. The United States is one of the few industrialized nations that doesn't offer paid leave. Most women go back to work 2 weeks after having birth. American dads in our country, 70% of them take off less than 10 days after their partner has a child. 10 days. If we had had paid leave in those early months of COVID-19 crisis, we would have saved a lot of lives. we need paid leave. The third thing that we need is affordable childcare. It's way too expensive. One of the reasons why you see so many mothers leaving the economy in droves is because we have a broken structure of care. When schools didn't open and daycares were shut and we couldn't invite our parents into our homes to help us take care of our children, we were forced to take the third shift, go on food stamps, move in with our parents, not take that promotion or that opportunity. We were forced to shift and change and destroy our ambitions, our dreams, and our hopes. And that's because childcare today is not affordable. It needs to be. Finally, we have to open up schools safely 5 days a week. Without schools being open, there's no way that we will have a sustained economic recovery for mothers. But once they are opened, the job is still not done. So many of our children have been left behind, can't read, write, have mental health, or we're suffering a mental health crisis. We are going to need interventions to continue to take care of them. And finally, the other reason why we call this the she-cession is because many mothers found themselves in jobs that just weren't pandemic proof, like education, healthcare, retail. Those jobs aren't coming back. 70% of low-income families are run by a single household, and that is often a woman of color. So when she loses her job, the entire family suffers. What is the job retraining program that we can put into place to make sure that these moms can march back up into the middle class? The point is, we need a plan. We are calling for every state, every municipality to put together a task force. So you cannot change what you cannot measure. If we want to shorten the economic recovery for mothers, we need a plan. And we need to make sure that we are meeting our benchmarks, that we are encouraging mothers to get back into the workforce, that we are supporting them, that we are designing workplaces that are going to root out the motherhood penalty, and that we are finally, once and for all, valuing the unpaid labor. Because the reality is that we can continue to do those things. But if moms are still doing the vast majority of caretaking at home, they don't have the time, the space, or the bandwidth to get to equality in the workplace. Gender justice at home is connected to gender justice at work. And that's a conversation we need to have. So I encourage all of you to continue to fight, to help again take moms from rage to hope, to make sure that we center mothers in economic recovery. And that if we build back America back better, let's build motherhood back better. Join our movement at MarshallPlanForMoms.com, sign our petition, and join our campaign. And keep fighting. If we stay together, if we stick together, if we think bigger, brighter, bolder, we can do this. Thank you.
Brief summary, kids were out of school. I still had to go to work full time. Is that brief enough?
I am a mother of 2 boys, a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old.
Twin 8-year-old boys.
4 little boys, and I'm an ER nurse. I had to take on the role of being their mom, their teacher, and on top of it all, I still had to work nights, full time.
It was so surreal because I'm not a teacher. I have 0 patience, so I was just kind of like plugging holes.
I'm a teacher and my son suffered. And I had to sacrifice my son's education. I had to sacrifice my own career.
And my kids were suffering. And I was just in tears. I was just like, well, I help me out here.
I have one kid that I'm trying to teach how to read. The other kid, I'm trying to figure out which different ways I gotta go in to figure out what homework, what classwork. And these are little kids. You all of a sudden, they expect them to use a computer. I mean, they've used the computer, they've been on YouTube, but have they ever typed, an 8-year-old typed up a Word document, saved it, and sent it as an attachment to their teacher? No. And so what do you do?
I didn't really. I mean, I worked, of course, but it was like, kids would pop on calls. It was embarrassing. I just felt like I was constantly apologizing.
Once we got sent home, I would say in the surge, November, we were home and my work never left. Something had to give.
I'll give you a glimpse into Friday. The type of work that I do, I work nights. My husband would leave for work. During the day, I would homeschool the children. Everybody would be on their online class. We'd cook dinner, we would take baths, and at the end, I would take my shower and go right into work overnight. So that was a 24-hour shift for me, and I did that for 1 year.
We all had to definitely sacrifice things for our career. And I'm just thinking about myself. There's no family that I know where the dad was considering taking a leave from work or had to rearrange his life in order to take care of the kids.
I feel like this is now going to be the norm, and that's what scares the shit out of me, of like, we're just going to be expected to do more with less.
So I ended up enrolling my 5-year-old into a private, I got him a private tutor. There was no financial assistance. At the end of the year, I found out that it wasn't tax deductible either.
The nanny, who I'm paying like MKA tuition for, so I might as well be sending them to private school.
The money that I put out in childcare is not something that we planned for, and it's definitely a strain.
I think that there need to be more incentives to companies in New Jersey to come up with creative childcare solutions. So funding to these nonprofits who are doing it right and who are trying to really like help the kids.
The fact that the healthcare workers had to go to the front line to basically be there for your loved one, and the fact that there was nobody there for my kids was like the most hurtful thing that I think a lot of the healthcare workers are going through.
No cost mental health care options, specifically for moms.
There has to be that flexibility with employers and with people who don't have any other options.
From a medical background, stress and anxiety, everybody deals with it differently.
I tend to just kind of like barrel through things, and I just shut down mentally. I mean, that's what I did.
It was medication. There was a point that I just couldn't function, and I recognized that I was not in a place where I was able to take care of my children.
For me, I deal with it up front, and it probably built up and built up and built up, and I think I'll see the consequences down the road.
I worry that we're gonna come out of this and then have like the reckoning, right? Of like, what have I really lived with? Sorry, my phone.
Hey, what's up? What was the time of our birth? Hi, Poppy. Shh, you have to be quiet, okay?
In a good way.
Thank you. And I apologize for some of you may have experienced a lag in the video and sound for the last video, but it was very moving. I want to now kick off our second panel. And now that we've learned more about the nature of the problem we're facing, both the economic data, which was shared during the first panel, and a glimpse that we've just seen into the personal toll of this she-cession, I want to now welcome and introduce our next panel. These business and governmental leaders are joining us to discuss steps taken to date to address the economic disparities faced and challenges faced by women, and potential future initiatives that could help tackle these challenges and make women more resilient economically in the future. And each of our panelists brings her own unique perspective to the conversation. I'm going to start in introducing, giving background on each. I'll start with the creator of the video that we just saw, and I apologize, Jessica, for that lag there. Jessica Gonzalez is an award-winning New Jersey entrepreneur based in the great city of Newark, and she is founder and CEO of InCharged, an event technology company, Vendex, and Lux Disinfect, a company she began during the pandemic to provide tools, products, and services to help others safely reopen their businesses. and that those businesses are located in Newark, New Jersey. In April of 2020, she was appointed by Governor Murphy to serve as a member of his Restart and Recovery Commission, a team of renowned business, academic, health, and policy leaders dedicated to helping guide New Jersey's COVID-19 recovery. Assemblywoman Eliana Pinter-Marin has been a member of New Jersey State Assembly since 2013, representing the 29th Legislative District, which is Jessica's district. In that short amount of time, she has held numerous leadership positions, including her present role as chair of the Assembly Budget Committee and member of the Appropriations and Joint Budget Oversight Committees. She is a proud parent and vigorous advocate for women and families, and has worked closely with her fellow lawmakers on crucial measures to restore state funding for family planning centers, ensure equal pay for women, sponsoring legislation to extend postpartum coverage for women under Medicaid, just to name a few. Dr. Zakiya Smith-Ellis serves as Chief Policy Advisor to Governor Phil Murphy, where she is responsible for developing and directing the governor's policy initiatives in coordination with the cabinet. Previous to that role, she served as Governor Murphy's cabinet, in Governor Murphy's cabinet as Secretary of Higher Education. Prior to joining the Murphy cabinet, Zakiya led work at the Lumina Foundation, the nation's largest foundation focused solely on higher education. And she served in President Barack Obama's administration as a senior advisor for education at the White House Domestic Policy Council and at the U.S. Department of Education. And we're also pleased to be joined today by Louise Weingrod, Vice President of Global Taxation for Johnson & Johnson. Louise joined New Jersey-based J&J in 1999 and is responsible for all aspects of taxation for J&J's pharmaceutical, medical device, and consumer businesses around the world. Johnson & Johnson is recognized as a global leader for policies that promote corporate diversity and equity, and has won numerous awards as a top employer for diversity, inclusion, and gender equity, as a top employer for executive women, a top company for working mothers, which has, and with what has to be a record 34 consecutive years on Working Mother magazine's list of best 100 best companies. Almost 50% of J&J's employees worldwide are women, and women hold 45% of US management positions. Amongst her roles, Louise leads J&J's Global Finance Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council. So I'm going to start today with Jessica. Jessica, we heard from our prior panel, and I hope you all had a chance to maybe listen to that, but I'll share some of their insights as we discuss things today. We heard from our prior panel that there are numerous challenges women have faced and continue to face that have led to this she-cession that we're now in the midst of, whether it's lack of affordable or accessible care options for loved ones, wage inequity, the need for paid family leave. And I just am curious, through your work with the Governor's Restart Commission and in preparing for today's conference, you've been reaching out and talking to colleagues about the challenges they've dealt with, and your video highlighted a few of those voices. Can you shed any more light on what you've heard and learned from women that policy and corporate leaders should take to heart as they try to address these challenges?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for including me today on this panel and allowing me to share some of these voices. The first thing that I do want to say is thank you to the women in the video who were very vulnerable and real and honest and shared all the things that they were going through, which I appreciate, and hope this can help further policy changing. When we were on the Restart Recover Commission, and I heard you guys mention a she-cession. The first thing that came to mind was all of my friends, family, colleagues who were suffering, and there was really no outlet for them to be able to speak about it, only amongst themselves. And there were so many underlying things that I feel the data can't necessarily show, that could only be uncovered through just talking and having these conversations. Things that I realized after actually having conversation with a lot of women and colleagues were that things like mental health were not being addressed. There's no options for mothers who need, or caregivers who need access to mental health, to get it either virtually or in an easier way. The cost of childcare was something that everybody was struggling with, even myself being a mother of two. That was a big thing that, we weren't hearing too much about, or not even hearing too much about. Everybody knows childcare is fairly expensive, but, what can be done to help? And other things that I, uncovered is affordable care for middle-class families. I do know that the state gives options for lower income families, but once you hit a certain pay gap, there has not been any extra help to be able to get through the expense of good childcare. And then one of the last things are just having more flexible work from home options, and also more affordable care options for, either children or elderly parents, to be able to afford us to get back into the workforce and excel in our career. So those were all the things that I've learned through interviewing, videoing, talking with women who are currently going through all these effects during COVID of naturally being that caregiver and having to step out of their careers to do that.
Okay, thank you. I want to turn to Zakia and Eliana now. Clearly, there's a lot of work still to be done based on what we've been hearing today, but a lot has already also taken place over the past few years. And I was wondering, starting with you, Zakia, and then Eliana, can you speak to initiatives that have been undertaken in New Jersey with regard to some of the challenges and how you think it's going to help address the issues that have created such disproportionate effects for women? And there's a whole range of issues, as I mentioned before, whether it's equal pay, affordable care, paid family leave, the topic of job training and creation, whether it's at community colleges or elsewhere, making education more affordable from pre-K through college. A lot of the people affected during this pandemic have been the younger workers who come out of college and have college debt and other issues they're already contending with. So can you kind of talk about what has been done so far in the state of New Jersey and where you see future challenges?
Yeah, thank you. And the first panel was really great at highlighting what are the issues from an economic standpoint in dollars and cents. As Jessica just mentioned, childcare came up a ton, but also when we talk about the wage gap and the underlying reasons for the wage gap, some of the things that you just mentioned, the disparities in the kinds of jobs that women have versus men and the pay for those. So to that end, I would say there are a couple of things that I would highlight, and then areas where there's definitely more work to be done. Certainly on expanding access to job training and through apprenticeships. Historically, apprenticeships are thought to be, I think, in the trades, which are disproportionately, male dominated. And our Commissioner of Labor and our administration has been really pushing getting more women into apprenticeships, and has really increased double the percentage of women that have been in the apprenticeship programs that we fund through the state, which is really great. I think diversifying those even further is something that we don't often think about in this way, but I'm a former higher education secretary, but I'll be the first to say that not everybody's going to go to a four-year college. And so there are great paying jobs in those pipelines, but if those pipelines are really only for men, what does that do for being able to close the wage gap? But the other thing is, sometimes the reason women aren't in some of those jobs is not because they're not interested or they're not exposed or they don't have the training, but because of some of the aspects of our care economy and not having access to childcare. And in the videos that you just showed really highlighted, as you know, Liz, I had a baby during the pandemic in December. And so the access to childcare during this particular time has been a real struggle for a lot of women. And one thing that we were able to do with some of the federal money that we had was increase the threshold for our childcare program up to $100,000. So Previously, it was really, I think Jessica kind of mentioned this, those subsidies usually are for lower earning women. And we saw here that there were many families who had, or not just lower earning women, but lower earning families, but there were many families who had a need for childcare here who just couldn't afford it. And that continues to be the case. We could talk more, but just one piece that I would note on the childcare front, that I think there's more to be done, certainly, is that childcare has both a quality, problem and an access problem. So many women are struggling to find not only somebody to take care of the kids, but everybody wants, you want, to be a high quality place. You want to make sure they're learning something. You want to make sure they're safe. And it's the hardest thing. Again, I experienced this, to hand over your baby to somebody, and then you're looking around saying, okay, what does this place look like? Can I make sure that if they fall asleep here, that they're not going to be in an unsafe situation or something goes on? And unfortunately, we just don't have sometimes the pay that we need for our childcare workers, who are fantastic, to be able to be to be able to attract folks and to be able to keep people in those really important jobs. I don't remember if it was discussed in the first panel, but many folks nationally have talked about this is a national problem. It's a federal infrastructure problem. And President Biden has really suggested that from federal infrastructure perspective, childcare and having a national system where we're actually funding childcare for a universal childcare system would be solution. That's the kind of thing that's very difficult to do at a state level, just in terms of the amount of investment that it would take. But we have done some baby steps, I would say, in New Jersey with some of our federal dollars that we've been given to help bolster childcare facilities during the pandemic through grants to the providers themselves, as well as subsidies for individuals. So those are just a few things that I'm happy to talk, and I'm looking forward to the panel discussion about other items as well.
Ileana, did you? And Ileana, I don't know if you joined before earlier on when I was introducing all of you, but Jessica is one of your constituents. So I'm just throwing that out there. Her company is located in your district.
Still will be my constituent after this. I joined right after I had a previous meeting that ran a little bit late. So thank you for having me, Liz. By the way, Liz and I are former colleagues in the assembly, and then she decided to just desert me and leave and go on to do bigger and better things. So I want to say thank you for having me. Thank you for all the women that was here. Jessica, I'm going to go look back. I know my staff was looking to kind of take a look at your video, because I was told by text that it was very good. So thank you for sharing that. And I think, Zakia, you touched on quite a few things. Congratulations. I haven't seen you in a while. I miss you. We did do quite a bit on childcare, but I think we have a long way to go. I have an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old, and kind of doing what we do as legislators and working a full-time job is very tough, right? So childcare is definitely an issue, but I'm at least glad that Governor Murphy has really paid attention to this. And I think, Jessica, you touched on it, which is we do a decent job, not a great job, of providing for lower income families when it comes to childcare. But you're right, like that whole middle class and in between, we kind of like leave behind, and the cost is so astronomical that it becomes a problem. And I think we do need to fix it. But to be quite honest with you, as Akia pointed out, it does have to be part of a federal plan. We're not the only state that's really having a struggle with this issue. And this is how us as females, if we want to have a family, right? And I think a lot of us do, but we want to be participating in the workforce, it makes it very difficult at times, and hard choices that we have to make as not only part of the workforce, but as being a mom. But I do want to say that, we have done a couple of things in the past. We've expanded access to preschool, right? That's been in the budget the last couple of years, is trying to expand our preschool. I live in the city of Newark. Our preschool is phenomenal. It's really a national model. Everyone should have access to preschool. And really, we have to get back to, there are still some districts that do not have full day kindergarten. That is extremely helpful. And it's hurtful if you have an all-day preschool and then you go back to having a half-day kindergarten, right? So you see a large gap there. And then also when you have a full-day preschool, and then you have not everyone that opts in, kindergarten is really that mishmash of a grade where you're trying to get kids caught up, right? And still trying to keep the kids that are ahead on pace. So I think we still have ways to go there, and Governor Murphy has been great with funding for that. We have family leave, which is something that we've done, the paid family leave, right? When I even came into the legislature, we did not have that. We had only a portion of it was paid for. I think it was 6 weeks, and now we've extended it to, I think, 8, if I'm not mistaken, or longer. So we did do that. And I think, Zakia, you did the best on touching with the wage gap as well, right? As a mom, I say it all the time. I don't know how I did it. I am extremely grateful and thankful. I've had my parents that have been very helpful in this whole situation, right? And I think during the pandemic, family has become almost essential. And for those moms that are working and have not had access to that, it's been such a struggle for them. So I think that when you're talking about wage gap, we can't continue to work as females and participate in that environment if we're not being paid enough to sustain a household as well, or at least be helpful. So Liz, I don't know if there's anything else you want me to kind of get into.
Yeah, I want to continue this discussion. I'm going to turn to Louise, but just some food for thought for later on in the discussion. Two issues. One, we've focused a lot on childcare, but there is a significant issue also with elder care and other loved ones who women and families look after. That is another issue that we need to address. I know that Medicare does not cover nursing home or assisted living stays or in-home care. Only Medicaid does, and in many states, Medicaid does not cover those needs. So, and when you're relying on Medicaid, that means, families have to spend down their resources in order to be able to access that funding. So I know we've seen that, in our office, people who have loved ones at home, parents, et cetera, they need assistance too, to help them meet those needs. And just on the childcare piece, I was reading a report that referred to the Lanham Act back during World War II, where the men had left factories and were off serving in the military, and women were called upon to keep the nation, manufacturing, but there was no childcare system, and the Lanham Act included federal dollars that put in place an entire network of childcare centers. You did not have to be working in the factories to utilize the centers, but then, when the war ended and the men came back, those slowly folded. But it's been done before, where we've seen that as a national priority. I think that's kind of been referenced, as Zakia mentioned, about the President Biden's infrastructure plan, looking at care as something necessary for infrastructure improvement. So we have an example that we could utilize as we look to how to address this in the future. But I'd like to switch to Louise now, who brings a whole different perspective. J&J, as I mentioned, has been a corporate leader in policies that promote gender equity and diversity. And I'm wondering if you can kind of share why this is the case, why do they have and deserve this reputation, kind of what your story is there, and how do you think other companies can and institutions can perhaps model some of the best practices you've seen in place at J&J? I'm just going to turn yourself.
Probably good to go off mute. Thank you so much for that opportunity. I'm just so privileged and energized to be on a panel with these fantastic women. And Jessica, I loved the video. Just loved it. And you could have just as well been interviewing people from my group. I don't have young kids anymore, but I do have a 91-year-old mom who's living with me since the start of the COVID crisis. And boy, that was great and accurate storytelling of real experience. So just a little bit on my story, a little bit on J&J values, and a little bit on some of what we're doing to implement those values. And I hope that'll be helpful to, one view of what can be done. I joined J&J 22 years ago. I was a tax lawyer working at a New York City law firm. At the time, I had an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old. So Eliana, that was ringing with me. My work life was exciting, interesting, and expansive, but so consuming that it was completely at odds with who I hoped to be and how I hope to show up in the world as a mother, as a spouse, as a friend, as a family member, and just basically as a centered human being. I was offered an interview at J&J and wasn't interviewing at the time, but took the interview because I had the general impression that the company had a strong ethical core and was a good place to work for people regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, ability level, etc. When I arrived at the headquarters in New Brunswick, I was very impressed by the people. I was very impressed by the work, by the mission. But what I was most surprised by was a range of offerings that were designed to reduce day-to-day stress and burden on real people. We had stellar on-site daycare. Today, that's not so unusual. But when J&J put it in place in New Brunswick, it was. And it has a sliding scale to make it affordable, and everybody who can use it does use it. I had the bad fortune to join when I already had a 5-year-old starting kindergarten, if only I had joined a few years earlier. And it's a beautiful and great institution. But in addition, there were a lot of little things like drop-off laundry service, so you didn't have to go drop stuff off, on-site banking, even dinners that could be pre-ordered from the cafeteria and taken home before you left the office. Just a lot of little things to make life more livable for real people. When I joined, I immediately became involved with the Women's Leadership Initiative, which was at an early stage of rolling out what has now become signature policy on flexibility arrangements, flexible work arrangements of all sorts, with all sorts of structure and governance around them, including what was then a new concept of flexibility ambassadors who were driving the real cultural change you need on the grassroots level to have a program like that adopted. And I hope we'll come back to flexibility in the context of COVID and what we're seeing now with remote work as we're all contemplating going back or already back in the office. But most important, I found an environment where diversity, like me, was embraced and supported based on merit, despite my gaping interests in things like golf and professional sports, which were back then how all meetings started with discussion. So, you roll forward 22 years and I almost never go, nothing wrong with golf or professional sports if that's your interest, but I almost never go to a meeting where the first 10 minutes is spent on that. Today, I am one of 4 women reporting to our CFO, Joe Wolk, out of a group of 10. And our executive committee reporting to our CEO includes 3 stellar women leaders out of a group of 10. And there's nothing other than core about their roles. One leads our pharmaceutical business, a second leads our medical device business, and a third leads our global supply chain. As our CEO, Alex Gorski, says, we're pleased but not satisfied because we see diversity, equity, inclusion as core value and key business driver. So if I could, just let me tell you a little bit about our values. I'm sitting in front of a picture of what stands in stone in our corporate headquarters. We call it our credo. It's a mission statement, which today is common, but it was adopted by the then CEO of Johnson & Johnson in 1943. At the time, corporate mission statements were a kind of radical thing. And it has 4 paragraphs and talks about what we must do. The first paragraph covers our obligations to the mothers and fathers, doctors and nurses, the stakeholders who use our products. Second paragraph is about our obligations to our employees. Third paragraph is about our obligations to the communities in which we live and operate. And the fourth goes to, if we do these things, the shareholders will make a reasonable return. And at the time, the company was still private, just going public, so that was the family. The second paragraph on employees and the third paragraph on communities informs our diversity, equity, and inclusion and our environmental, social, and governance goals very, very directly. And those goals are published annually in what we call our Health for Humanity report. It's a great read. The 2020 version's coming out on June 9th, next week, so I want to make a plug for it. Two of the goals in that report that are particularly relevant are women in management. By 2025, we are committed to achieving 50% of women in management positions globally. As mentioned, we're getting there in the US, but it's a large world for us. And secondly, women in STEM 2D by 2025, we're committed to engage 2 million girls in STEM 2D activities. So I want to just really briefly tell you a little bit about two programs that are helping us on both those fronts, and they're just two examples. One is the Women's Leadership Program called Elevate. It started as a initiative by, this is an employee resource group of women, to bring in a speaker series for women that it's committed to fostering an inclusive mindset and environment. Executives of J&J and also well-known external figures are, speak. We've had people like Jennifer Garner, the actor producer, Dr. Edith Eva Eger, who is a Holocaust survivor and clinical psychologist, Tarana Burke, the founder of the Me Too movement, Vera Wang, a fashion designer and breast cancer humanitarian award winner, Nicole Kidman, Iska Lawrence, and Malala Yousafzai. I think I'm mispronouncing her name, but we know her as Malala, the Nobel laureate and girls' education activist, just some among others. And these conversations are designed to foster the reinforcement of core priorities like self-care, mental health, well-being. And the initiative also forges partnerships with organizations to drive external change that's positive. So authentic conversations, there's a charitable partnership platform, and there's an element of it that includes support for small women-owned businesses to spotlight and collaborate with these businesses to help audiences discover more meaningful choices. And of course, these businesses were very badly hurt in the pandemic, disproportionately, as has been discussed. And this program is one element of trying to drive positive change. On the We STEM 2D, you may wonder, what does that stand for? Women in science, technology, engineering, math, manufacturing, and design. Math and manufacturing is the two. So we've been championing women and giving them the tools and resources and opportunities to succeed at work and home since the company was founded 130 years ago, when 8 of the original 14 employees were women, although I assure you they were not CEO at the time. However, this program, which is a large program, is committed to igniting the power of women inside and outside the company to improve health and the health of society. And it operates by building partnerships to open new doors, by focusing on youth, university, and professionals. So it has arms to encourage women in these WISTEM 2D fields, working with girls, as in our ESG goals, lots of scholarship programs and other activities with students, and working with professionals to improve women. So these are just two examples of others that reflect the values and what we're trying to drive. And I'd have to say I'm completely a product of this environment. And I think we have a lot to learn and a lot more to do, but there's a lot there we're happy to share.
Thanks, Louise. And I just want to put you're sitting in front of the credo. When we talked earlier, you mentioned how that credo is developed and is essentially, it sounds like a living document that employees help contribute what they think you want to talk just for a minute about that? How?
Sure. That's a great point, and thank you. It was designed in 1943, and the basic structure and focus of it and much of the wording is exactly the same. But there've been a small number of updates over the years. The latest was just a few years ago, where there were focus groups all over the world. We routinely also have credo challenges where it is a living document. It's something that we talk about daily and that really does guide our decision making. We don't always get everything perfect, but we certainly are committed, and we to the credo. It's a very core belief in J&J. So a couple of years ago, when there was a refresh, a review, a recommitment to our credo, a number of changes were made based on focus group discussion. And some of them had to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. For example, it was observed in a focus group in South Africa that not everybody identifies as a man or a woman. So why are we calling the employees men or women? Why don't we just call them employees? And that completely makes sense because we have trans colleagues who are excluded from that. And why are we excluding them? That's not our intention. In many ways, we highlighted diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also environmental commitment, which Johnson & Johnson sees as environmental as health. And we're a healthcare company, and that's core to our commitment. So those were some of the areas of update. But the update is maybe more important for the process than the product because it recommits us and gives us ownership.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. The next question is for all panelists, and it's what's next. I mean, we've seen a lot of data, heard personal stories, and there's clearly a recognition, I think, in Washington that this is an area that deserves and demands focus. Resources are being made available, and we want to make sure that those resources are targeted in a meaningful way. And Jessica, I know the needs of small businesses could be much different from the needs of more the larger corporations. As a small business owner, what would you like to see as your what's next? Where would you like to see the attention focused in a way that could help you and the women deal with the challenges they've faced during the pandemic and prior to the pandemic?
Well, as a mom of two, and paying astronomical childcare costs, I think it would be helpful to start maybe extending some daycare hours. What we've been doing for our employees is we have given them the option to continue to work from home if they're available or allowed to. I think that other small businesses should be given the resources to be able to have their employees have a more flexible work schedule. I tell my employees all the time that I understand life doesn't fit in a 9-to-5 box. Life happens at all times of the day. And work could sometimes move and be from 6 to 8 a.m. and then take a break, take your kids to school. So I'm pushing for that within my organization. I think there should be some extra resources to help other small businesses give women and caregivers that type of flexibility as we come out of a year of being home 24/7. I know that there's a lot of anxiety behind that. I'm anxious about it. It's intense to leave your kids and what you've been accustomed to for the last year and just throw yourself right back into work. So I think there needs to be a lot of empathy with that and flexibility, and tools, again, given to smaller businesses to allow for women to work more flexible schedules and be able to take care of their kids. It's hard to leave your kids after a year. Other things that I'd like to see, I think just continuing to open that conversation and that dialogue. I think more groups or places where women and caregivers can speak amongst each other and just have a place to be and be able to share stories and not feel alone is going to be really important. And taking care of that mental health aspect, allowing women to have mental health days. You shouldn't just have to leave your office because you're sick. You could also just be having a rough time. You need to decompress. You need somebody to talk to. And I think access to those resources, we should really be talking about and allowing for people who've been inside for a year plus, and going through losing wages, taking care of their children 24/7, all that stuff, having access to somebody to talk to. I think we really need to push for that. Those are my thoughts.
All right, that's great. Thank you. Eliana, some of what Jessica was just mentioning echoed some of what you see as a need and a priority. Is there anything else that you've heard today that would, you think we should focus on? Some of you chair the budget committee. You're a key policymaker in terms of where we should focus our state resources. Do you see things that we should be discussing, maybe moving forward? Obviously, we're still waiting for guidance on much of the money that we've received as a state,
Right.
but as we explore options, are there some areas you think we should be?
I think that there's a large appetite, and I think, Jessica, you touched on a lot of this, right? In my conversations with leadership, and especially on the assembly side with the speaker, there's a clear need for some additional funds. I think at some point, right, once we get additional guidance for childcare, right, and childcare comes in very different ways. I just want to share. So it is hard to leave the kids after a certain amount of time, but I have to tell you, I almost felt guilty. And I'm sharing, my personal story, because the days that I would come into the office, it was almost like, like it was like I could fully just concentrate on one thing, right? If we're having a Zoom or we're having a meeting or whatever it is, like that, I didn't have to worry about where the 5-year-old was going. I have to bribe her to not come into a Zoom so that, I looked somewhat professional at home, right? Because I think it's the image, right, that we want to portray as a female, which, brings a whole other series of questions, right? But it's cute when everyone sees our kids on Zoom, right? And I appreciate that. But then sometimes I can't help but think, is it cute or is it just unprofessional, right? And I think there's where we are struggling with who we are, right, as a mom and trying to be taken serious in the workplace. But it was almost like a refreshing, like the 2 days that I would have to come in, because it was like my break, right? And then halfway through the day, I would like, oh my God, but like I miss not having her cling on to me, right? Or so then you feel guilty. And I just wanted to share that because these are just some of the things that I think a lot of us as females and as moms struggled with during the pandemic. I think, look, right, putting more money into it is only going to fix it. But I think there's other things I think we can be creative as a state in doing. And Zaki, I'm probably going to need your help with this, but maybe having a longer school day, right? That's something that we've been talking about for quite a few years, I think, in the legislature, but obviously there it goes. It requires a little bit more funding, and having a longer school day doesn't necessarily mean that the kids are going to be sitting at a desk learning, right? It could be that after that average school day ends, right, you have that extended portion, but you get to do things where we used to have after school programming, but throughout the years, it's all been kind of cut back, right? So maybe we can be creative and figure out how we can do that. I know for myself, that would be like a big help in a lot of us, so that we don't have to try to find aftercare from 3:30 to 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, right? At least it would even cut down a little bit on how much we would have to pay. So that's something that we can maybe talk about, or even a longer school year, right? Getting out in June, and then having July and August, and then only going back in September. That's a long time for us to financially do something with the kids. And I think it's just, and I know maybe the kids will hate me for saying this, right? It's also a loss of opportunity that we have where kids could still be engaged, right? And we can be more creative of what that longer school year looks like. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity, Liz, that we can kind of, now that we've really started having these conversations again, I don't want it to take a back seat. I want it to kind of continue, and maybe we can get some, real traction here in doing things that are creative and outside of the box, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I was good. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
J&J, I just want to know, like, where do I sign up? I know I'm running for another 2 years, but.
Well, can I just throw something out?
Yeah.
What the comments on mental health and well-being are so well made. And I want to say there is low-hanging fruit there. We have a very small office within our global health office that focuses on mental health, because of course mental health is part of health. And the folks from that office will do presentations for us at town halls that I've experienced as transformative. You know, when you bring in the right expert to talk about mindfulness and stress and you do a webcast, it's fantastic. And I can't imagine that that would be very expensive. These things can be recorded. Other companies are doing similar things, and maybe it's something to think about. I mean, that's not more than a session, but they can be very actionable and very informative and make a big difference for people.
Yeah, I was going to turn it to Zakia, but that's a great point. And I was thinking both with your remarks just now, Louise, and Eliana, you're talking about the kids coming in and out of the Zoom, and that there's a certain image women strive to maybe achieve in the workplace and how that could be a challenge. But I think I sit here and look at this group of women on the screen and the group of women we had on the previous screen, and the hundreds who signed up to participate today. I think the more of us there are, there's going to be more empathy for this. We're not going to feel that we have something we can be professional, and we have empathy for the situation where, okay, we're juggling a lot of balls, but we can juggle a lot of balls. And to Louise's point, having sort of a presentation on mental health and sharing those challenges and solutions with people helps people realize the stresses that the folks Jessica talked to, and that you're not alone, that we empathize and we understand. And in a lot of cases, like Louise walking into the boardroom back, however many years ago, and sitting through, no offense to golfers, but sitting through a golf discussion for the first 10 minutes, the boardrooms are changing, as she said, and the more women that are in leadership positions and are in these discussions, I think more power to make changes that make us, more empathetic for the challenges that more than half this population faces on a daily basis. So I just want to turn to Zakia and see your thoughts on next steps.
Yeah, this was actually a really great conversation. And I know, Liz, you had talked about having this be a place where we are fomenting new ideas. And one that we have been kind of noodling with, or that I've been thinking about with some folks, is how do you think about extended school day? So I'm glad the Assembly women brought that up. That's something that we should be thinking more about. Our school districts are in a rare situation where they've got a lot of federal funding now. So some of the challenges that maybe we would have had before, maybe there's a way for them to kind of have some models that, because we know that a lot of students, a lot of kids maybe fell behind during this time, there's a real need for that. And that also helps with childcare. And then also a lot of schools, when they're hybrid mode, they were ending before lunchtime. And so even if they were in school full time, your workday doesn't end at lunchtime unless you have a really interesting working arrangement. And so we know that those are things that we need to work through. But one of the things, just listening to the policy, the Johnson & Johnson, I'm wondering if we couldn't tie, and this is again just big picture thinking, couldn't tie some of this relief that we give to businesses, to those businesses, like maybe giving a greater amount to businesses that do have some of those flexible policies in place. Again, to Jessica's point, like how do you support businesses to do those kinds of things? If we're giving aid to help a small business, maybe we can say, well, you get a greater grant amount if you have a childcare subsidy or something, or if you have childcare flexible work arrangements for your employees. Those are just, again, trying to brainstorm ideas. That was something that really resonated with me, the need to have that encouragement throughout businesses as well. And then we have our own issues as a state workforce, which we need to figure out. The return to work conundrum, I think, is not, and this goes beyond just women, really having, for so many people to have been mostly professionals, because a lot of frontline workers have been going to work. If you work at a grocery store or a Target or something, you've been going to work this whole time. But a lot of professionals and others who could work from home have been at home so long that there's a real challenge mentally to thinking about what does it mean to be in the office, even if you are vaccinated. I will say, when you have small kids who can't be vaccinated, I think there's an additional okay, what does this mean? Could I asymptomatically transmit this to my kids? That kind of thing. So just a lot to work through, I think, from a return to work perspective as well, in ways that we probably haven't even fully contemplated yet from a mental health perspective.
All right. One of the things that was brought up by the first panel, and I had ended that first panel asking if they had advice for your panel, like what would they recommend based on all the data that they had been observing with regard to the gender inequities and the disproportionate effect economically of the pandemic on women. They had all agreed on the need for an enormous investment needed in child and loved one care. The recommendation is that for a family income, 7% should cover your child care needs. And yet, I think the statistics showed that in 33 states, the cost for childcare exceeded the cost for in-state college tuition. So that is something, we really need to seriously consider here in New Jersey. Also expanding social safety nets, which we have taken some significant strides towards here in New Jersey. UI, TANF, SNAP, expanding EITC and child dependent care tax credit, which has been ramped up in the past 3 years to 40% EITC. And in the proposed budget this year from the governor, we've proposed expanding benefits and eligibility in both child dependent care and EITC programs. But also a lot of women have lost their jobs during the pandemic or stepped away from their jobs because of having to balance so many needs. And a lot of them are in industries that took a real hit during the pandemic: hospitality industries, tourism, retail was one of the statistics they spoke about, how despite the fact that retail jobs are held 50-50 men, women, the vast majority of retail jobs that were lost were by women in this pandemic. And it highlighted for them the need to invest in training for everybody, but it would especially help women who have been hit during this pandemic. So retraining and upscaling. And they pointed out the Atlantic City example where, because of the casinos that have shut down, they had at one point, I think, 46% unemployment. And there's questions about how many of those jobs will actually come back. So, Zakia, I know when you were head of the Secretary of Higher Education, you worked with the governor to spearhead the CCOG program for community colleges, free community colleges. That was something that our first panel kind of focused on, the need for training in community colleges. So can you speak at all about how we can help women and they're at the lower end of the pay scale? We've seen that in this pandemic also, that it was a K-shaped recession, and that the people that are at the higher end of the pay scale, to the extent they were affected at all, rebounded very quickly. And those at the lower end of the pay scale, many of whom are the sole breadwinners for their families, women, really bore the brunt of it. So can you talk a little bit about what we can do for women who need, maybe retraining to help rebound from the pandemic?
Absolutely. And that was on my list of things that I realized that I didn't get to it at the beginning, for sure. One of the things that we were able to do in partnership with the legislature is offer a free college to any individual in the state who earns less than $65,000. Again, higher ed has a similar problem to childcare, right? Where we have still not enough help for those at the lower end, but the help that we do have tends to be folks there. But this is huge as a game changer for, if you think about it, if you are a single mother who's in a low wage job, that is the sweet spot for you. And we saw that in the number of folks who were impacted. I think my video maybe, oh, there it is. Okay, came back. So the free community college effort is something that, community colleges disproportionately serve women of color, actually. And I know that was something from the first conversation. There's additional challenges in terms of just the wage gap for Latino women and for Black women. In that wage gap, it's more pronounced in those areas. So those are groups that are, again, disproportionately served by community colleges in a good way. It's a stepping stone, and seeing women being able to take advantage of that free option. We're now kind of poised to be able to potentially expand that to have students go to a four-year college as well and get assistance. We have a really great program in New Jersey called EOF. I know you were a big supporter of that while you were in the legislature, and continue to be a big supporter here in the cabinet. But the governor's budget proposed increasing funding to EOF to more students, and that also, again, helps a lot of students of color, not exclusively, but many students of color get the wraparound supports while they're in college. Just two other things that I would mention that help, not just with training, but working women, working families, are EITC and then the Child Independent Care Tax Credit, which are both expanded this year. So to just give people cash in hand to do what they need to do, whether that is additional help with childcare, whether that is putting food on the table, whether that's just helping, buy some extra toys or something. We know that folks just need, from a stimulative standpoint, it helps our economy, but it also helps individuals who, especially those at the lower end of the economic spectrum, who have borne the brunt of our economic challenges over the past year. Those are the folks whose jobs were not easily put on Zoom. And that's been the biggest, I think, challenge, is you see some of that gig economy work that really dried up through some of the pieces of the shutdowns that we have and are only just now coming back online.
Okay, thanks, Zakia. I have one other question I just want to talk about before Kathy Brennan, our Deputy Treasurer, has been, and we have a whole team here, they've been collecting questions from our audience who's been following this on YouTube, and we may have time for a couple of those. Before I do that, though, I know a few of us have talked about the need for flexible work schedules. Jessica mentioned that, Liana's mentioned it, Zakia, and I'm wondering, Louise, you mentioned, I think, that is something that J&J has explored. Can you share anything as maybe a model that we can, as we try and tackle this as a state, what your experience or what J&J's experience and what they're doing in this area?
Oh, sure. No, I'm happy to. Pre-COVID was a different world on flexibility than post-COVID. And let me come back to that. But pre-COVID, what was developed was toolkit, policy strategy toolkit around different types of flexibility. Ad hoc flexibility, how it works when somebody has to take their kid to a doctor, or child is sick, or you're having a repair person show up at your house. That's just ad hoc. But then how do flexible work arrangements work, where there's a regular arrangement where somebody is working perhaps different hours because of needs to drop off kids at school or pick them up, or perhaps some days from home. And 20 years ago, this was radical stuff. 20 in our industry anyway. 20 years ago, people wondered, will people really get their job done, and how can they get their job done if they're not doing FaceTime in the office? And we demonstrated and drove a lot of acceptance of that. I have to say, my then boss, our former CEO, Dominic Caruso, was our best asset, because he announced that he works on Fridays from home, as that's how he sees his grandchildren. And once your CFO announces that they can do it, it's hard to explain why other people can't, do that too, to spend more time with family and still accomplish what they need to. Fast forward to COVID. Oh my goodness. I mean, like at J&J, and we are 2/3 of our workforce are the privileged types. My organization, we're tax people. We never thought we could, but we have managed to work and work well with a lot of stress and a lot of wear and tear, but work and get our jobs done from home. 1/3 of our workforce never worked from home because they're in laboratories, or they're in factories, or they're in supply chain, and they had to be present. But for the 2/3 who worked from home, we've demonstrated that one doesn't have to be in the office all the time. And we already knew that with trends around flexible space and such. What we are now working very hard on, and many companies are, we're committed to being back in the office because we think that's the best place for brainstorming, and it's the best place for partnering, and it's the best place for training and learning. But we recognize also that flexibility is so much more a part of people's lives now that people will want to work from home, some amount of time. And so what we're doing is we're developing governance and strategies, because it's one thing to say yes, but we also have to make sure our payroll withholding is right, and we have to make sure that our benefits are correct, and we have to make sure that our tax returns are right. So what we're, the short answer to your question is we are in the process of developing, as other companies are too, strategies that's accommodating what the company needs, what people want, and ensuring that we're compliant with the various legal systems that are impacted by people being in different places.
All right, thanks. That should help inform the discussion going forward. Zakia, as we try and figure out as you said, Louise, it's a very complicated process. But I want to now, we've been getting questions from some of those following us, and I want to bring on Deputy Treasurer Kathy Brennan. There she is, who is just going to ask a couple of those before we wrap up. Go ahead, Kath.
Hi, it's great to join you. It's been a really interesting discussion. And a lot of what you've already talked about has gotten to the question of the persistent wage gap, and a lot of the comments we've received from today's participants have focused on the persistent wage gap. We've also, in response to the survey that Treasury put out leading up to this conference, actually a number of the participants who are registered today say they themselves have experienced a persistent wage gap. Zakia, you mentioned some of the policy programs that are available to help Black and Latino women in particular. But one of the other questions we've received has been focused on immigrant women and how we might be able to support immigrant women and that particular population and their New Jersey-born children. And I'm wondering if perhaps the panel might address that question.
Well, I can start and be brief and just say, I think some of the things that we know when it comes to just wage discrimination in general, being paid differently because of who you are, how you look, how you sound, transparency, just knowing what your male counterparts are making for the same job is really powerful, because it allows you to be able to know. Sometimes you just don't even know that you're being underpaid until years later. That's how Lily Ledbetter found that out. And so I'm really proud that New Jersey was able to pass some of the strongest wage discrimination, anti-discrimination laws in the country for gender equity. That alone, isn't enough, because again, sometimes it becomes a lack of access to education or training that might make you qualify for some of the jobs. So that's one thing you can do for outright discrimination. But I think kind of continuing to pour into programs that do provide for education and training and workforce training is another way that we can address this, and specifically those that target women of color.
And I just want to say, Zakia, thank you for bringing that up, because I think that training is a big and important component of this, right? Undocumented women, obviously, and men as well, but more so women suffer much more greatly because they are obviously, there's a scare component, right? But then there's that huge lack of training where you could be potentially making a little more money, but there isn't training, or you don't know how to get to the training or how it is accessible. And that's a big problem too. I think that New Jersey has a long way to go when it comes to that. Whether Black or Latino women, we know that those are specifically with this pandemic, last pandemic, those are real frontline workers. Those are grocery stores. Those are retail. Those are the women that are really trying to provide for their families. And that's great that they have a job, but now how do we elevate them? And that's very tough unless we get them the proper training.
Okay, and then questions that we've received that maybe you might be able to address, the panel might be able to address from a more personal level, is we've received questions such as, I'm experiencing wage discrimination at work. Where do I go for help? Or how can I learn more about the Family and Medical Leave Act and other assistance programs available to me?
Well, maybe by the end of this, I can find the link. There should be links on our state website, one through our Department of Labor to kind of investigate if there's, it might be Department of Labor, it might be Department of the Attorney General's Office for discrimination, actually. But there's pieces on both of those angles. So if I can find a link before the end of this. I don't actually know if people can see the chat. So there might be another way maybe that we can get that information out. But through the state, if you're certainly experiencing discrimination that's based on gender, our Office of Civil Rights through the Attorney General's Office could investigate that. And then in terms of pay equity, that again was a law that was passed. So that should be something that you should be able to find out what your counterparts are making.
We also, when this session wraps in a few minutes, we will have a web page that people will be able to access, and we can add links to for questions on both of those issues through the website. We'll add those onto our page.
Oh yeah, and FMLA was the piece that will be on the Department of Labor's website. They have a really, I looked it up when I needed to take leave. It was actually really helpful in outlining what the family leave, paid family leave policy is.
Okay, and then we have another question regarding New Jersey as a place to do business, and the fact that New Jersey can be a very expensive state, both for individual taxpayers and for businesses. How can New Jersey afford more programs and mandates on employers? And this was addressed a little bit earlier with the use of federal funds. But are there, how can we incentivize businesses to provide more flexible programs to support families? And
I mean, I'll kick this over to whoever else wants to weigh in, but I think studies have shown that businesses that offer paid leave and other benefits for working families who have loved ones that they're taking care of, have seen higher productivity levels. The businesses, you have employees whose needs are being met there, they are more productive employees. So that would be one thing. I think, it benefits the business also to offer these types of benefits. Louise, I mean, I know, you had me when you said dinners that you could take home from the company, but your loyalty to your company, I'm sure rests on many things, but one of them seems to be that they value that and empathize with the challenges that you face and other employees face as working family members. So, I mean, New Jersey, part of what New Jersey tries to provide, and in the census shows that people are moving to New Jersey, even compared to our neighboring states, because we try to utilize the tax dollars that are being paid for high quality education and services that people can rely on. So as the governor says, we want to make sure that what people are getting a good value for their dollar. And that is part of the mission for the administration, to provide resources that make New Jersey a more attractive place to live. But I don't know, Louise, if you want to speak to what businesses could benefit from.
Yeah, no, I would say that the case for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and those are of course different things, but the case for that is a business case. I mean, it's our values as a company to embrace, but there's so many studies that show that, for example, innovation, and Johnson & Johnson is best known for the consumer products, but I guess these days we're also pretty well known for a vaccine. We're primarily a pharmaceutical company, and then our next biggest business is medical devices. And that's all dependent on innovation. And the more diverse your teams, including gender, the more innovative your teams. There are lots of studies that show that the more diverse your teams, the better you understand and relate to your customers and stakeholders and can meet their needs. The more diverse your teams, the better the leadership strategy you have. There's just lots and lots of studies making the business case for being a place that's a great place for women and everyone else to come together. And I'd say that in terms of how I manage personally, I'm very aware that over the course of a career, and we hope to attract people for a career, over the course of a career, there are different personal and health matters that impacts people's ability to show up. It used to be the case that men lost a lot more time than women because of the this going back 20 years. I don't know if it's still true, disproportionate impact of heart conditions and other health conditions on men versus women used to be the case. And yet culturally, we make a big deal out of maternity leave, and we make a big deal out of time when kids are little and people needed leave. And it was not fact-based at that time. We certainly get much better engagement and much better productivity. I am much more engaged and much more productive because of the environment I'm in, and I try to pass that on. And I think anything we can do in terms of incentives to drive that, it shouldn't be that everyone has to invent a wheel. To drive that would be great. And if we look a little beyond the United States, we see lots of models of countries, Europe, Canada, countries driving policy that's very effective and makes life more livable for people. So, it's all very expensive. It's all very complicated, but, happy to do anything we can to partner on that.
And if I could, I think that sometimes, yes, having different programs and adding a different things cost money. But I think then when you look at the overall, right, if your employees are happy, if your employees are productive, if you offer some of the basic things, like you said, the flexible schedule, maybe there's only an additional cost for providing some of the dinners because not everyone's going to want it, right? So it could be minimal things, but all I'm saying is that I think you then in return get an employee who's more productive, who actually wants to go to work because they love their office and they love their workplace and the people that they're around. And then if I could just finish off, of course, it's better to have a diverse workforce, and especially women, because let's just face it, the way we analyze data, the way we take in things, the way we're able to talk to one another, even in times of contention, right? By the time we walk away from the door, right, we have a different feeling. And sometimes that's not the same with our male counterparts, not to say that they're not great at other things, but I think that the way we think and the way we bring ideas to the table is completely different than if you're in a setting, and Louise, you probably could say this, if you're in this setting with the same type of people, right? And then your thoughts never get looked at as well.
Yeah, and that goes to race, ethnicity, culture, geography, economic, like the more diverse the thinking, the better. The other point I'd make is that we found, and we focus on raising all boats. Women have particular needs and particular challenges, especially in younger generations, though. It's a different model for many in the family, if there's a male partner in the family. And so we offer leave for fathers also when they have children. It's not as long because there's not the disability aspect to it, but some studies have found that if you give men flexibility in that first year, women are much more likely to come back to the office. And so there's an ecosystem to focus on, which good policy does.
And I just mentioned on that, I was listening to a podcast about this, and they did a study and looked at, I can't remember what country it was, if it was like Norway, and then also Japan, where they did have really, really generous maternity leave policies. Oh, and actually, so one was maternity leave, but then they found that that meant that the women were out of the workforce, and it actually kind of had a counter effect where you could take that, but then the men didn't have the same responsibility. So it was still on the woman to be at home. And as if you're a career-driven woman who cares about your family and your career, as Eliana kind of mentioned, you have this kind of guilt, like I'm out and I'm taking care of my kids. And of course I love that, but I would like the opportunity to, be a contributor to the workforce and have my voice at the table. So we just have to be thoughtful about how we make the policy so that we're not recreating a system where women are not in the workforce in a way that we think is helping, and make it just as acceptable for men to take time to be contributing members, and make it socially acceptable for them to be gone for longer periods as well.
All right. Thank you all. And I'm going to need to wrap it up, but this was really, I want to thank all the members of the panel. This was really an informative and a hopeful conversation. And we wanted to, with this forum, we wanted to share what the data was, but also leave with some ideas regarding policy steps and changes we can undertake and work together on. And this was so informative and really provided us with some great takeaways. So, but I just want to assure everybody the discussion is not going to stop here. The Murphy administration, with our partners in the legislature, are going to continue the work to address inequities, especially as we work to make sure that the state emerges from this pandemic, and everyone in the state in more resilient in the future. So I want to encourage you to share your stories. I think Kathy mentioned one of the takeaways from our survey so far is that the majority of respondents have experienced wage inequity in their careers. We want to hear from more of you, so please respond to the survey. It came with your registration for the Eventbrite. I also want to encourage you to visit our website. The address will be on the screen right after I finish here. We're going to include updates and links to information, additional data that was discussed today, and resources that you can utilize to help address any challenges you're finding from the pandemic or from disparities you've experienced in your work situation. And I want to thank the team here at Treasury for all their work on this. This has been a true labor of love for our department, and I couldn't have done this without them, starting with our communications team, Jen Shortino and Melinda Caliendo and Danielle Curry, who made this first time event seem effortless. And they, and together with Joanne Povia, Kathy Brennan, Dini Ajmani, Jennifer Keys Maloney, Andrea Spalla, Nicole Nicola, Julie Krause, Sharon Alessi, they've all shared their time, their insights, their experience, their research, despite having been pulled in a million different directions, which I'm sure after this forum sounds all too familiar. And also our teams at our Office of Revenue and Economic Analysis and Taxation for all their work in helping to provide data. So I thank them, and I thank all of you for participating today. We look forward to continuing this discussion and taking the lessons learned today and turning them into action. So thank you, and have a great rest of the day and a great weekend. Thanks.